Steven Stainer was 7 when he was abducted a few blocks from his home in Merced, California. Years later, against all odds, he emerged from the ordeal as a hero, and he was reunited with his family. The story of Steven Stainer is tightly intertwined with the story of his older brother, Cary. It reads like something like a modernized version of Cain and Abel. It all started when Steven was walking home from school on December 4th, 1972. A man named Kenneth Parnell convinced a coworker to help him lure the young boy into a car with promises of giving him a ride home. The men stopped by a payphone and pretended to call his mother. When Kenneth returned to the car, he told Steven his parents no longer wanted him and he was going to go live with Kenneth instead. From that moment forward, Steven Stainer was known as Dennis Parnell. He was told to call his abductor Dad. For 7 agonizing years, Steven was too terrified to escape or ask for help. But all that changed once he began to get a little older. Steven was bound to get too old to interest him any longer. He would have to find another young boy to fulfill his twisted desires. When his captor finally did manage to kidnap a 5-year-old boy, Timmy White, Steven immediately became protective of him. He made it a point never to let Timmy and Kenneth be alone together. Steven realized he couldn't keep Timmy safe forever. They had to make a run for it. The boys finally seized their chance in March of 1980. While Kenneth was at work, the boys slipped out of the house and hitchhiked their way to a nearby police station. So now 14, the memories of his old life with his actual family had become dull and fuzzy, but there was one thing he managed to hang on to. I know my first name is Steven. It was all he could tell the investigators about his former life, but luckily it was all they needed. After a terrifying ordeal, both boys were finally reunited with their overjoyed families. The story inspired a media whirlwind that included a book and a made-for-TV movie, both named after that one piece of his old self that remained on the day that he brought Timmy White back to safety. I know my first name is Steven. Steven returned to Merced as a hero into the waiting arms of the parents that mourned his loss for so long. Now, after his disappearance, the Stainers had desperately searched for their son, so consumed by their grief that their other 4 children began to feel neglected. Now, one of the Stainer sisters later appeared in a Hulu 3-part docuseries based on the case. She explained her household's dynamic after Steven's return. She said, "A lot of attention went to Steven. We all got a little jealous, especially Cary." According to his sister, Cary was always a little off. At the age of 3, he was diagnosed with trichotillomania. It's a compulsive disorder that drives the sufferer to systematically pluck out their own hair. By the time he turned 6, he already had violent fantasies of harming women and young girls, and the thoughts only grew more frequent and more as he got older. He was 11 when Steven went missing, and Cary secretly blamed himself for his brother's disappearance, as if his evil thoughts had somehow attracted enough bad karma to manifest a real-life tragedy in the family. Kenneth Parnell was convicted of kidnapping and false imprisonment and sentenced to 7 years in prison. He only served 5 before he was released, which is kind of enraging when you stop to think that he spent way less time in jail than Steven spent being his hostage. In 2004, Kenneth was once again hauled off to prison, though, this time for attempting to literally buy a child, and he was given 25 to life for his crimes. He died behind bars 4 years later at the age of 76. So by the time Steven turned 20, it seemed like he was finally going to be able to put most of his past behind him. He married his high school sweetheart, Jody, and they went on to have 2 children over the next few years. He also did a lot of work with child abduction groups, and he spoke to kids about that stranger danger thing, warning them to be cautious and reminding them that not every adult has good intentions when they approach a child on the street. So tragically, Steven's brand new life was cut short on September 16th, 1989. It was the night before the Emmy Awards, and the movie based on his harrowing ordeal was nominated in 4 different categories. He was riding his motorcycle home from work without a helmet when he was hit by a car. The driver sped away. He died less than an hour later. And the driver that hit him would later be sentenced to 3 months in prison for this felony hit and run that prematurely ended Steven's extraordinary story. So after his brother's sudden death, Cary's life started going off the rails. In 1997, he was hired as a handyman at the Cedar Lodge. 2 years later, in February of 1999, Cary Stayner finally snapped. February was part of the off-season for Cedar Lodge, so there usually weren't that many people around looking for a room, and unfortunately it gave Cary the perfect opportunity to act out the desires that preoccupied him, even as a young boy. For a while, he merely peeped through a window, watching his intended prey carry on with getting settled into their temporary quarters. It didn't take long to come up with a plan. Toolbox in hand, he knocked on the door. He explained that he was the maintenance guy and he asked to take a look at a supposed leak in their bathroom. With no reason to doubt his claim, Carol invited him inside. It was a fatal mistake. He walked into their room, closed the door behind him, and he pulled out a gun. First, he strangled Carol with a rope from his toolbox, and then he turned his attention to the terrified girls, killing Sylvina and dragging Julie, still alive, into the back of the car her mother had rented for the trip. Then he drove her to a secluded area. He assaulted her. He left her body at the scene and drove back to the lodge where he shoved the remaining 2 corpses into the trunk and headed for another isolated, densely wooded area. When he found a spot that felt right, he got out of the car, set it on fire, and walked away. At the end of July, Cary met Joy Armstrong, the woman who would become his 4th and final victim. After forcing Joy into his car, he intended to drive her to another location, but in her desperation to escape his clutches, Joy jumped out of the moving vehicle and she tried to make a run for it. Though Cary flew into a rage, he caught her before she could get too far and he brutally snuffed out her life. Her friends quickly noticed her absence and filed a missing persons report. And when the police went to check out her cabin, they found obvious signs of a struggle. Half a mile from her home, they found her body next to a body of water. There was an abundance of evidence in and around Joy's home, evidence that pointed straight to Cary Stayner. On top of that, several witnesses mentioned seeing his car parked near the cabin. Now, since Joy Armstrong's murder occurred in a national park, Cary Stayner was tried in federal court. In order to avoid the death penalty, he pled guilty to premeditated first-degree murder, felony first-degree murder, kidnapping resulting in death, and attempted aggravated resulting in death. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for Joy's murder. Now, the trial for the murders of Carol, Julie, and Sylvina took place in state court, and there he pled not guilty by reason of insanity. The jury didn't buy it. On August 27th, 2002, he was convicted on 3 counts of murder with special circumstances. He was sentenced to death row to wait for his final march to the execution chamber. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you soon.